The lawyer's hands trembled as he set the folder on my kitchen table. "Colonel Parker," he said, "your grandfather's trust is now worth $40 million, and it's still only in your name." I stared at the numbers for a long moment, then closed the folder and slid it into a drawer. My father had just gotten married that afternoon. His new wife had spent the entire reception asking me how much money I had. I smiled and said nothing. I had no idea that silence would soon become the most important decision of my life. I hadn't been home in almost 8 months. 24 years in the Army teaches you that home is wherever your orders send you. But some part of me still thought of this town, the dogwoods along Miller Street, the smell of my mother's kitchen, even though she'd been gone 12 years now, as the only place that counted. I flew in on a Thursday, changed out of my uniform in an airport bathroom, and drove straight to the venue in a rental car with a dent in the bumper nobody bothered to mention. My father, Richard Parker, was getting married again. 69 years old, and he looked younger than I'd seen him in a decade. Silver hair combed back a new tan, a suit that fit him better than anything he'd worn to my mother's funeral. I stood at the back of the small chapel and watched him wait at the altar, and something in my chest pulled tight and loose at the same time. He deserved happiness. I believed that. I still believe it now. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't wary the moment I saw Vanessa Brooks walk down that aisle. She was 42, striking in a way that seemed calculated rather than natural, every hair and every seam placed with intention. I watched her eyes move across the room during the vows, not at my father, but at the guests, cataloging who mattered and who didn't. When she reached me in the receiving line, her smile widened just slightly the way people smile at something they're deciding whether to bother with. "You must be Christine," she said, taking both my hands in hers like we were old friends. "Richard talks about you constantly, his brave little soldier." "Colonel, actually," I said, keeping my voice light. "But Christine's fine too." At the reception, she found me 3 separate times. The first time she asked whether I owned property. I told her I rented an apartment near base housing, which was true, though I left out that I could have bought the building outright if I'd wanted to. The second time, she asked how much a colonel's salary came to, phrased as idle curiosity, her eyes sharp underneath it. I gave her a number that was accurate and unremarkable. The third time, she leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and sweet, and asked if I planned to help support my father in his retirement. "He's never asked me for anything," I said. "I don't imagine he'll start now." She laughed like I'd made a joke, though I hadn't meant it as one. I watched her drift back toward my father's side, watched her hand settle on his arm with practiced ease, and I thought about how little she actually knew about who was sitting across the table from her in a rented dress uniform drinking club soda because I had a report due Monday. I wore my dress blues that day not out of pride, but because I didn't own anything fancier and hadn't had time to shop. I drove a Ford Explorer with 130,000 miles on it. My apartment had government-issue furniture I'd never bothered to replace. To anyone looking, I was exactly what I appeared to be: a career officer, unmarried, modest, unremarkable, in the way that people assume soldiers are unremarkable, as though a life of discipline leaves no room for anything else. What Vanessa didn't know, what almost no one knew, was sitting in my email inbox that very morning. A message from an attorney named Walter Hobbs, asking if we could speak privately before I flew back out. He found me near the parking lot after the cake had been cut, after my father had danced his first dance as a married man again, his hand at the small of Vanessa's back like he'd forgotten how to hold anyone else. Walter was in his 70s now, had been my grandfather's attorney for almost 40 years, and he looked at me with the particular gravity of a man carrying something heavy. "Your grandfather's trust," he said without preamble. "It's grown considerably. I think it's time we talked about what that means going forward." We sat in his car with the doors closed, engine running for the air conditioning, and he walked me through it. The investments my grandfather had made decades ago, quietly, patiently, had multiplied beyond anything either of us expected. $40 million. My name and only my name on every document. I remembered my grandfather's voice from years before, sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. "Don't you ever talk about this money until you truly need to," he'd told me. "Money changes how people look at you before it ever changes your life. Guard that as long as you can." I told Walter I understood, thanked him, and walked back into the reception where my father was laughing at something Vanessa had whispered in his ear. I smiled at both of them, accepted a glass of champagne I didn't drink, and let the evening close around me like nothing had changed. It was the smartest decision I ever made. 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from my father's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Dot Simmons, who'd known our family since before I could walk. She mentioned almost in passing that a moving truck had pulled up to my father's house and hauled away most of the furniture my mother had picked out years ago. New couches, new dining set, new everything. I thanked Dot for letting me know, hung up the phone, and sat with that information for a long while before I decided it wasn't my business to interfere. That was the thing about Vanessa Brooks. She moved fast, and she moved with purpose. Within a month of the wedding, she'd redecorated the house top to bottom, replaced my father's longtime financial advisor with someone she knew personally, and restructured the joint bank accounts so that her name appeared first on every statement. My father mentioned it to me on the phone once, almost sheepishly, like he was confessing to something. "She just likes things organized," he said. "You know how women can be about a household." I didn't correct him. I'd learned a long time ago that some battles aren't worth fighting until they come looking for you. What I didn't know at the time was that Vanessa had already started looking for me. She began quietly, the way careful people do. A conversation here, a question there, always framed as a harmless curiosity. She asked my father's old golfing buddies about my career. She asked a cousin of mine at a family barbecue I wasn't invited to whether I'd ever mentioned an inheritance. She pulled whatever public records she could find: my military service history, my rank, my base pay as a colonel, the modest apartment lease under my name. Everything she found painted the same picture: a disciplined, unmarried army officer with a government salary and no visible wealth. Exactly what I looked like, exactly what I wanted her to see. For a while, that seemed to satisfy her. My father told me later that Vanessa had once remarked almost dismissively that I played soldier, while everyone else in the family built real lives. I didn't take offense. 24 years of service teaches you not to need anyone's validation, especially not from someone who's known you for 6 months. But then at a dinner party, I also wasn't invited to. An old family friend named Harold Whitfield mentioned something he probably shouldn't have. Harold had known my grandfather for decades, had played cards with him every Thursday night for the better part of 30 years, and he said casually, the way old men say things when they've had one drink too many, that my grandfather had left something substantial for the family, something tied up in a trust that nobody talked about anymore. Vanessa didn't let it go. Dot told me later that Vanessa had asked Harold to repeat himself, then asked follow-up questions with an intensity that made Harold uncomfortable enough to change the subject. Whatever instinct Vanessa possessed, and she possessed a sharp one, I'll give her, that told her there was more to my quiet, uneventful life than what appeared on the surface. She hired an estate attorney the following week. Not a family lawyer, not someone to help her and my father plan their future together, but a specialist in inheritance disputes, a man named Preston Cole, who had a reputation, according to Walter Hobbs, when I called to check, for finding cracks in trusts that other lawyers assumed were airtight. I want to be clear about something because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. My father knew none of this. Richard Parker is not a devious man. He is, if anything, a man who loves too easily and questions too little, especially now that he was newly remarried and desperate not to disturb the peace he'd found after years of loneliness following my mother's death. He didn't know Vanessa was digging through old rumors about a family fortune. He didn't know she'd hired a lawyer who specialized in prying apart trusts. He was playing golf, tending the garden my mother used to love, and falling asleep most nights beside a woman who was quietly building a case against his own daughter. I found out about Preston Cole through Walter, who'd heard about the inquiry through mutual contacts in the estate law community. It's a small world, apparently, when $40 million is involved. Walter called me on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing supply reports at my desk, his voice careful in a way that told me before his words did that something had shifted. "Someone's asking questions about your grandfather's trust," he said. "Formal questions. The kind lawyers ask when they're building towards something." I asked him who. "A woman named Vanessa Brooks," he said. "I believe she's your father's wife now." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking out my window at the base housing units lined up in identical rows, thinking about how quickly a wedding toast can turn into a battle plan. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger requires surprise, and some part of me had expected this from the moment I watched her count the room during her own wedding reception. "Thank you for telling me, Walter," I said. "Let's make sure everything is in order." He assured me it already was. My grandfather had been meticulous, and the trust had been updated and reviewed regularly over the years, each version notarized and witnessed with a precision that bordered on obsessive. But meticulous paperwork doesn't stop a determined person from trying. And Vanessa Brooks, I was beginning to understand, was nothing if not determined. I didn't call my father to warn him. I didn't confront Vanessa. I went back to my reports, finished my coffee, and let the quiet keep doing what it had always done, protecting me until the moment I decided it no longer needed to. I was on leave that weekend, home in the small rental house I kept near base, kneeling in the dirt of my backyard garden with soil under my fingernails and a pair of pruning shears in my hand. It was the kind of ordinary Saturday morning I rarely got. No reports, no formations, nothing but the tomato plants I'd been neglecting for months and the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I didn't hear the car pull up. I heard the doorbell instead, sharp and unfamiliar against the quiet. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked around front, expecting maybe a delivery, maybe a neighbor. Instead, I found Vanessa Brooks standing on my porch in a cream-colored blazer, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and beside her a man in a gray suit holding a leather folder against his chest like a shield. Neither of them had called ahead. Neither of them had been invited. "Christine," Vanessa said, stepping forward before I'd even opened the storm door all the way, "we need to talk." I looked at the man beside her. He introduced himself as Preston Cole, an attorney, and extended a hand I didn't take. "We represent your father's interests," he said, though I noticed he didn't say my father had sent them. I could have shut the door. Some part of me wanted to. But 24 years of command teaches you that the moment you let someone see you rattled is the moment you lose whatever ground you're standing on. So instead, I stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," I said. "Can I get either of you water?" Vanessa blinked, clearly having expected resistance, maybe even a shouting match on the porch that she could later describe to my father as evidence of my instability. Instead, she walked past me into my living room, glancing around at the modest furniture, the bookshelf full of military history and gardening manuals, the single-framed photo of my grandfather on the mantel. I watched her file all of it away, the same way she'd filed away my rental car and my dress uniform at the wedding. We sat. I didn't offer coffee, just water, and I poured it myself, unhurried, letting the silence stretch a little longer than was comfortable. Preston Cole opened his folder and cleared his throat. "Colonel Parker," he said, "we have reason to believe you are concealing assets that rightfully belong to your father's estate. Specifically, a trust established by your late grandfather, which we believe was intended to benefit the broader family, not a single individual." I set my glass down on a coaster, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at him steadily. That's a serious accusation," I said. "Do you have documentation supporting that claim?" He hesitated just slightly, the kind of hesitation that told me he had suspicion but not proof. "We're in the process of gathering it," he said. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice softening into something almost maternal, almost concerned. "Christine, nobody wants this to get ugly. Your father is getting older. He deserves security. If there's money that's meant for the family, it should go toward taking care of him, not sitting untouched somewhere while he worries about retirement. I studied her for a moment. There was something almost admirable about her performance, the way she'd shifted from accusation to concern in a single breath, as though she were the one protecting my father's interests rather than her own. I thought about my grandfather's voice on his porch years ago, the way he'd told me that money changes how people look at you before it changes anything real about your life. "I appreciate your concern for my father," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I'm not going to discuss private financial matters based on assumptions and rumors. If you believe there's a legitimate claim here, I'd suggest you put it in writing and let the appropriate parties review it." Preston Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "Are you saying you deny the existence of any trust?" "I'm saying I'm not going to litigate my family's private affairs in my living room on a Saturday morning," I said. "If this is truly about my father's well-being, I'd expect him to be sitting here with you. He isn't. I find that curious." Vanessa's expression flickered just for a second, something sharp passing behind her eyes before the concerned mask slid back into place. "Richard doesn't need to be burdened with legal details," she said. "That's what I'm here for, to protect him." "Then protect him," I said. "But don't mistake my patience for confusion about what's happening here." I stood, which was as clear a signal as I could give without raising my voice, and after a moment Preston Cole stood, too, closing his folder. Vanessa remained seated a beat longer, as though testing whether I'd crack under the silence, but I simply waited, hands folded, until she finally rose as well. At the door, she turned back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This doesn't have to become a legal matter, Christine. We could resolve this like family." "If this becomes a legal matter," I said, "it won't be because of anything I've done. If you have a claim, let the courts decide whether it holds up." She studied me for a long moment, and I watched something calculate behind her expression. Not fear, not yet, but the recalibration of someone who'd expected an easier target. She smiled again, thinner this time, and walked back to her car with Preston Cole trailing behind her like a shadow. I closed the door, went back to my garden, and knelt in the dirt again, though my hands weren't quite steady anymore. My father still knew nothing about any of this. And somewhere between the wedding toast and this morning, his new wife had decided that whatever I had was worth taking by force if I wouldn't hand it over willingly. I picked up my shears and went back to the tomatoes because there was nothing else to do until she made her next move. 2 weeks after Vanessa stood in my living room with her lawyer, I received a certified letter informing me that a civil claim had been filed against me in probate court. I read it standing in my kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter, and felt something in my chest go very still and very calm. The particular stillness that used to settle over me before a difficult briefing. The kind of quiet that meant it was time to stop reacting and start preparing. The claim itself was built on a foundation of implication rather than fact. Preston Cole's filing argued that my grandfather's trust, though legally structured in my name alone, had been intended to benefit the wider Parker family, and that my father, as the last surviving child of the original trust creator, held an equitable interest that had been wrongfully excluded. It was a theory built on air, but theories built on air can still cost a great deal of money and time to knock down, and I suspected Vanessa understood that better than most. Word traveled faster than I expected. A cousin called to ask if it was true. A former commanding officer, now retired and living 2 states away, sent a short email that simply read, "Heard about the lawsuit. Call if you need anything." Even a reporter from the local paper, the kind of small outlet that covered county fairs and school board meetings, reached out asking if I'd comment on a family dispute involving a prominent local officer. I declined. I had no interest in trying this case in the press. At work, the whispers were harder to avoid. The Army is its own small town in some ways, gossip moving through units the way it moves through any close community. And I could feel eyes on me in the mess hall, in the hallways, colleagues who didn't quite know what to say. So they said nothing at all. Or worse, offered the kind of gentle advice people give when they assume you're in over your head. Maybe just settle, one friend suggested over coffee. Give her something. Make it go away. I understood the impulse. Settlements are quiet. They don't require depositions or discovery or the particular exhaustion of proving a negative. But settling would have meant admitting even implicitly that there was something to settle, that my grandfather's wishes were negotiable, that Vanessa's manufactured claim carried enough weight to warrant a payout. I hadn't spent 24 years building a reputation on discipline and integrity just to fold the first time someone pushed. No, I told my friend. If she wants to fight, we'll fight. I called Walter Hobbs the same afternoon and asked him to pull everything, every document, every version of the trust, every piece of correspondence my grandfather had ever generated related to his estate planning. Walter, to his credit, had already anticipated the request. He'd spent the better part of 2 weeks assembling what would become the backbone of my defense. What emerged was more thorough than even I expected. My grandfather, it turned out, had been almost obsessive about documenting his intentions in the years before his death. There were handwritten letters dated and signed explaining in his own words why the trust existed and why it belonged to me specifically, not out of favoritism, he'd written, but because I was the one who understood the weight of responsibility, the one who'd never asked him for anything. There was more. Years earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge, my grandfather had sat for a short video with Walter present as a witness, stating clearly and calmly that the trust was to pass to me alone, that no other family member held any claim to it, present or future. The video was dated notarized and referenced explicitly in the trust documents themselves. Walter had kept a digital copy in a secure file for over a decade, waiting for a day he probably hoped would never come. Beyond the letters and the video, there were the trust amendments themselves, 5 of them over the years, each one reviewed by independent counsel, each one reaffirming the same intent with growing specificity, as though my grandfather had known even then that someone might one day try to argue otherwise. The paperwork wasn't just solid, it was a fortress. "This isn't a close case," Walter told me, sliding the final folder across his desk during our meeting. "Their filing doesn't have a single piece of documentary evidence supporting the claim that your grandfather intended anything other than what's written here. This is bluster. It's meant to intimidate you into a settlement before it ever reaches a judge." I believed him, but I also knew that bluster left unanswered has a way of becoming reality in the eyes of people who don't know better, family members, old friends, my own father, who I still hadn't spoken to directly about any of this. I asked Walter what he thought I should do about that. "Let the court answer it," he said, publicly, definitively. That way there's no room left for doubt from Vanessa or from anyone else. I thought about my father, about the man who'd raised me after my mother died, who'd stood at that altar 3 months ago looking happier than I'd seen him in years. I thought about how devastating it would be for him to learn in open court that his new wife had spent months building a legal case against his own daughter behind his back. There was no version of this that wouldn't hurt him. The only choice left was whether the truth came out on my terms or on Vanessa's. "Let's set a court date," I told Walter. "It's time to finish this." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and quiet, the kind of room built for careful reasoning rather than spectacle. I wore my dress uniform not for effect, but because it felt honest. This was who I was, the same person who'd stood at my father's wedding answering Vanessa's questions with a patience I no longer felt obligated to maintain. Walter sat beside me, calm as ever, a stack of folders arranged with military precision on the table in front of us. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later with Preston Cole at her side, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked expensive even from across the room. She carried herself with the same confidence she'd shown on my porch months earlier, chin-lifted eyes scanning the gallery as though counting an audience rather than facing a judge. My father was not with her. I learned later she'd told him the court date had been moved, a small lie meant to keep him away from a truth she wasn't ready for him to see. The judge, a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb, with silver hair and a voice that carried without ever rising, called the proceedings to order. and Preston Cole opened with a version of the argument he'd rehearsed in my living room that my grandfather's trust, though legally structured in my name, had been morally and practically intended for the entire family, and that excluding my father constituted an injustice the court should correct. He spent a long time on tone. He described my father as a man overlooked in his own family's fortune, painted Vanessa as a devoted wife, simply advocating for her husband's rightful inheritance, and characterized me without saying it outright as someone who'd hoarded wealth in secrecy while my father struggled to plan for retirement. It was a compelling story if you didn't know the facts underneath it. I sat still through all of it, hands folded, the way I'd learned to sit through hostile briefings years ago, absorbing without reacting. Because reaction is what people are hoping for when they're building a narrative rather than a case. When it was Walter's turn, he didn't raise his voice either. He simply began laying out the trust documents one by one, methodical and unhurried. He read portions of my grandfather's handwritten letters into the record, his voice steady as he described a man who had thought carefully, deliberately, and repeatedly about who should inherit what he'd built. He played the video, my grandfather's face filling a small screen at the front of the courtroom. His voice a little frailer than I remembered, but his words unmistakably clear, stating that the trust belonged to me and to no one else present or future. I watched the judge's expression as the video played. I watched Preston Cole's jaw tighten, and I watched Vanessa for the first time since I'd met her look genuinely uncertain. But Walter wasn't finished. He'd spent weeks working with a forensic accountant, and what emerged next shifted the entire tenor of the room. Bank records showed that in the months following her wedding, Vanessa had initiated 3 separate attempts to consolidate my father's existing assets under joint accounts that listed her as primary beneficiary. Emails subpoenaed from her financial advisor's office revealed conversations in which she'd asked pointed questions about what would happen to those assets if something happened to Richard. Text messages to Preston Cole sent weeks before she'd ever knocked on my door showed her instructing him to find whatever leverage exists to pressure me into a settlement regardless of the trust's actual legal standing. The gallery went quiet in a different way than before. I glanced at my father's empty seat and felt something twist in my chest, grief for a version of this day where he might have been spared all of it. Preston Cole tried to object, tried to characterize the financial records as unrelated to the matter at hand, but Judge Whitcomb overruled him with a single line that a party's credibility and motive were entirely relevant to a claim built on alleged family loyalty. Vanessa's face, composed for months, finally cracked just slightly, a flicker of panic passing through eyes that had always seemed so certain. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway to find my father standing near the water fountain, his face pale, a folder of the exhibit copies trembling slightly in his hands. He must have come once he realized the date hadn't actually moved. He looked at me the way a man looks when the ground beneath him has genuinely shifted. "Christine," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "is this true? All of it?" I didn't answer with anger, though I had every right to. I simply nodded. "It's all documented, Dad. Every piece of it." He looked down at the folder in his hands, at the printed emails and bank statements with Vanessa's name attached to each one, and I watched 24 years of careful discipline keep me standing still, while my father absorbed in real time exactly how thoroughly he'd been managed. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, Christine, I didn't know any of this. I believe you. I told him and I meant it." We stood there together in that hallway, 2 people who'd just watched a marriage and a family both come apart under fluorescent light, waiting for the bailiff to call us back inside to hear whatever came next. Judge Whitcomb took less than 10 minutes to return with her ruling, though it felt longer sitting in that wood-paneled room with my father beside me, now his folder of exhibits resting untouched on his lap. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same measured calm it had held throughout the proceedings, but there was no mistaking the weight behind her words. "This court finds no legitimate legal or equitable claim on the part of the plaintiff," she said, looking directly at Vanessa. The trust in question was established with clear, repeatedly reaffirmed intent, documented extensively across multiple decades, naming Colonel Christine Parker as sole beneficiary. This claim is not only without merit, it appears to have been filed in bad faith, motivated by financial interests, unrelated to any genuine concern for family welfare. She went further than I expected. Citing the pattern of behavior Walter had uncovered, the attempts to consolidate my father's assets, the instructions to Preston Cole to manufacture leverage rather than pursue a legitimate claim. Judge Whitcomb ordered Vanessa to cover the full cost of litigation, including my legal fees, and referred the matter to the State Bar for review of Preston Cole's conduct in filing a claim he should have known was baseless. Vanessa sat rigid through the entire ruling, her composure finally completely gone. When the judge dismissed the court, she didn't look at my father, she didn't look at me. She gathered her things quickly, whispered something sharp to Preston Cole, and walked out through the side doors without a word to anyone. My father and I sat in the gallery a while longer, neither of us in a hurry to move. The room emptied around us, footsteps and murmured conversations fading into the hallway, until it was just the two of us, and the quiet hum of the overhead lights. "I should have seen it," he finally said, his voice rough. "I was so afraid of being alone after your mother died that I let myself believe whatever made the loneliness stop. I stopped asking questions. I stopped noticing things I should have noticed." He looked down at his hands folded tight in his lap. "I let her push you out of my life a little more every month, and I told myself it was just her being protective of our new marriage. I'm sorry, Christine. I'm so sorry. I studied my father in that moment, really studied him the way you study someone you love when you're trying to separate who they are from what they've done." He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way grief and shame can shrink a person, folding them inward. I thought about all the years he'd spent building a life with my mother, the steadiness he'd shown me growing up, and how easily even a steady man could lose his footing in the particular vertigo of late-life loneliness. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't hurt," I said carefully. "Watching you pull away over these last few months, hearing about the lawsuit before you even knew what your own wife was doing behind your back, that hurt more than I probably let on." "I know," he said. "I don't expect you to just forget it." "I'm not asking you to forget it either," I said. "But I can forgive you, Dad. I already have. What I can't do is pretend that trust rebuilds itself just because a judge ruled in my favor today. That's going to take time, real time, not just an apology in a courthouse hallway." He nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand in a way that made him look for just a moment like an old man rather than my father. "I understand," he said. "I'll take whatever time you need. I just don't want to lose you the way I almost did." We walked out of the courthouse together into afternoon light that felt too bright after hours inside, and I found myself matching my pace to his slower one the way I used to when I was a child, and he'd take my hand crossing busy streets. Somewhere in the parking lot he stopped and turned to face me fully. "Your grandfather knew, didn't he?" he said. "He knew something like this might happen someday. That's why he documented everything so carefully." "I think he knew people better than most of us do," I said. "He used to tell me that money changes how people see you before it changes anything real about your life. I think he was preparing for exactly this, even if he never said so directly." My father let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no real humor in it. $40 million, he said, shaking his head. "And you never said a word, not once in all these years." "He asked me not to," I said. "Not until I truly needed to, and I never needed to until now." We stood there a moment longer in the parking lot, the sound of traffic drifting in from the street beyond both of us, quiet in the particular way people are quiet after surviving something neither of them fully understood until it was already happening. My father reached out and pulled me into a hug, brief and a little stiff, the kind that comes from a man unused to showing that much feeling in public, but real all the same. "I love you, Christine," he said. "I should have said that more this past year." "I love you too, Dad," I said. "Let's figure out what comes next, together this time." He nodded, and for the first time in months I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly, not resolved, not fully healed, but pointed finally in the right direction. Vanessa's marriage to my father didn't survive the year. She filed for divorce herself 3 months after the ruling before he ever got the chance to. I think some part of her understood there was nothing left to salvage once the financial motive had been exposed in open court, once the community that mattered to my father had quietly, unmistakably turned against her. She left with far less than she'd arrived with: a modest settlement, no claim to the house, no claim to anything connected to our family. The last I heard, she'd moved 2 states away and started over somewhere nobody knew her name. My father sold the house not long after the divorce finalized. It had never really felt like his after my mother passed, and certainly not after Vanessa had stripped it of every trace of the life they'd built together. He found a small place 15 minutes from where I was stationed, close enough that we started having dinner together most Sundays, a habit neither of us had made time for in years before all of this happened. Trust, I'd told him, would take real time to rebuild. It did. But it rebuilt slowly and honestly, dinner by dinner, phone call by phone call, in a way that felt sturdier than anything that came before it. As for the $40 million, I never touched it for myself. I kept my apartment. I kept my Explorer, though I finally let the base mechanic replace the transmission that had been threatening to quit for 2 years. What changed wasn't my life. It was what I decided to build with something I'd been given rather than earned. I established 3 funds within a year of the trial. The first was a scholarship program for children of active duty service members, covering tuition costs that too many military families quietly struggle with while pretending everything is fine. The second was a support fund for military widows, the kind of assistance I wished had existed for women like my mother in the years after loss, when the paperwork and the loneliness arrive faster than anyone can prepare for. The third was a veterans care initiative funding transportation and medical support for aging veterans who had nobody left to drive them to appointments or sit with them through long afternoons. My father came to the first fundraising gala I organized, sitting in the front row in a suit that fit him the way suits used to fit him before Vanessa, before any of it. I watched him from the podium as I spoke, watched him nod along, watched something like pride settle into his face in a way I hadn't seen since before my mother died. Afterward, he found me near the exit, waiting while I said goodbye to donors and old Army colleagues who'd shown up to support something they didn't fully understand but trusted because it carried my name. "Your grandfather would be proud of this," he said. "I know I keep saying that, but I mean it every time." I thought about my grandfather often in those months, more than I had in years. I found the last letter he'd ever written me tucked into the same folder Walter had used as evidence in court, and I read it again on a quiet evening not long after the gala. "If a day ever comes when you have to choose between money and character," he'd written in handwriting that had grown shakier toward the end of his life, "keep the character. The money will always find its way to the right person eventually. It found its way to you." I understood finally what he'd meant. The $40 million had never been the real inheritance. What he'd actually left me was something harder to quantify: patience, discipline, the ability to sit quietly through an accusation without needing to defend myself loudly, the wisdom to let truth do the work that anger never could. That was the legacy that mattered. The money was just the proof that he'd trusted me to carry it well. I still wear my uniform most days. I still drive the same roads I've always driven, still keep the same modest life I kept before any of this started, because that life was never a performance, it was simply who I am, trust fund or not. But now, once a year, I put on my dress blues and stand at a podium in front of people who've come to support military families they'll never meet, and I think about a porch, an iced tea glass sweating in an old man's hand, and a warning he gave me long before I understood how much I'd need it. My father stands near the back at every one of those events, now watching with a quiet pride I let myself believe is real, because I've decided that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing deliberately to keep building something better than what almost broke us. I think about my grandfather every single day. Not because of what he left me, but because of who he taught me to become before I ever needed to prove it. I want to know where you think this story goes next in your own life. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming. Let's keep this journey going together.